This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt Podcast. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. This is a case where I feel assured that the perpetrator committed the crime. However, in a high-stakes execution case, you really hope that the DNA gets tested. You're listening to episode 83, Suzanne Collins. 19-year-old Suzanne Marie Collins was a happy and outgoing person who was taking courses in avionics. She was a Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps and was stationed at Millington Naval Base. Millington, Tennessee is just north of Memphis and is a tiny community with just over 10,000 residents. Being so close to Memphis, Millington has a high crime rate, but it certainly has some unique highlights. It's known for being Justin Timberlake's childhood home and has a park called Beeman Shelby Forest State Park, which is one of Tennessee's top visited parks. Suzanne graduated from Robert Lee High School in Springfield, Virginia, and joined the Marines on June 26, 1984. She went to basic training at Parris Island, South Carolina, and arrived on the Millington Naval Base on October 20, 1984. Suzanne was graduating from Radar Technician School. Her goal was to be the first female Marine pilot because women were not allowed to fly planes in combat. On July 11, 1985, Suzanne stepped outside of her barracks in a red Marine t-shirt and shorts and white tennis shoes. She had been so busy that day that she wasn't able to find time to get to the gym, so she went for a run. It was a balmy 83 degrees at 10 p.m. when she began her run on the military base. The next morning, one of Suzanne's friends was looking for her. They agreed to meet up before the graduation ceremony. Suzanne never showed up. A Marine captain called this friend and delivered devastating news. Suzanne Collins' new body was found in Edmond Orgill Park, north of Navy Road and east of the base. Her clothes had been scattered around that area. Her hair was matted with blood, and her body sustained grave injuries. 29-year-old Sedley Alley was not in the military, but was married to a Navy woman, and the couple lived on the base. Sedley worked for an HVAC company in Millington. He struggled in his life with a substantial history of abusing drugs and alcohol. Sedley really enjoyed the hard stuff, PCP, LSD, meth. He had few friends, likely because of his anger management issues. He threatened acquaintances and beat both his first and second wives. On the morning of July 12, 1985, Alley was read his Miranda rights by the Naval Investigating Service, or the NIS. At first, he refused to cooperate with their investigation, but it didn't take long for him to divulge info. Without an attorney present, Alley gave a statement, which eventually turned into a 16-page confession. At 7 p.m. the prior evening, Allie's wife and two of her friends left for a Tupperware party. Alley had been drinking beer before they left. He estimated that by 9 p.m., he had taken down a six-pack and a fifth of wine. Alley got into his 1972 Mercury station wagon, which still displayed Kentucky license plates, and he drove over to the mini-mart to pick up another six-pack. Alley was unhappy and lonely. He didn't have any friends in Tennessee and missed Kentucky, where his parents, children, and friends all lived. Alley was debating what to do. He could stay in Tennessee, or drive back home to Kentucky, or drive his car into a wall. Alley drove over to the north side of the military base, parked in a lot near Orgill Park Golf Course, and started running toward Navy Lake. As he ran, he passed a woman who was also out running. When Sedley reached the lake, he stopped running. The woman caught up to him, and they briefly chatted. He didn't know who she was and had never seen her before. They both jogged back towards his car. Alley stopped for a beat because he was out of breath, then climbed into the station wagon. Suzanne continued running towards the gate on Navy Road. Alley drove towards the gate and drifted from side to side on the road because he was drunk. He heard a noise and realized he had hit the woman who had been jogging. She screamed and rolled a few times. Alley got out of his car to attend to the injured woman and said he would take her to the hospital. As he drove her to the hospital, Alley said the woman called him names and threatened to get him in trouble. At a traffic light, he turned the car around and headed back to the lake. Alley pulled her out of the car, hit her a few times, held her to the ground, and struck the side of her head with a screwdriver. He claimed he did not rape the woman because he was so scared of the legal trouble she threatened. After Alley said he struck the screwdriver into her head, he made it look like she had been raped. He took off her clothes and pulled the woman over to a tree. He broke off a tree limb and pushed it up her vagina. Sedley Alley got in his car and drove away. A little earlier that evening, a naval officer had been driving on base towards the lake and passed 2 male Marines who were jogging north. A little further down the road, he passed a female Marine wearing red who was also jogging. As he continued on, he saw a white male sitting in an old station wagon with wood paneling who was parked in an empty lot. The 2 jogging Marines were headed north, and the female Marine had been jogging south. After the female Marine ran past the male Marines, the station wagon with wood paneling barreled towards them and had nearly hit them. The car continued this erratic movement southbound, and the 2 male Marines heard a female voice yell out, "Don't touch me!" and "Leave me alone!" The 2 men turned around and headed towards the distressed woman, but it was too dark to see what was going on, as the station wagon was approximately 100 yards away. They watched the vehicle drive off towards the main gate. The 2 Marines suspected a kidnapping, so they went to the gate and reported the incident. Only one of the Marines could describe the female jogger. Military security drove around with the Marines to look for the station wagon, but could not find it. A police bulletin was issued for the station wagon, and Sedley Alley was stopped about midnight. The officer noticed that Alley's white tennis shoes were covered with grass clippings. Alley was brought in for questioning, and his wife later joined him. They answered many questions and somehow gave the NIS confidence that they had nothing to do with the kidnapping. All these interviews took place around 1 a.m. on July 12th. Alley was released, but he was being monitored. When Alley left the police station, so did the 2 Marines who had previously reported the kidnapping. When Alley turned on his poorly maintained station wagon, which he had to start with a screwdriver in the ignition instead of a key, the Marines immediately recognized the distinct sound of the defective exhaust system. They knew that this was the car that had dangerously swerved past them. Suzanne Collins missed a 4:30 a.m. roll call, and law enforcement found her body at 6 a.m. Officers first spotted a pile of clothes by the road, then found her body 150 feet away. Besides her clothing, they also found a pair of men's bikini underwear. Alley was picked up by the military police and was read his Miranda rights, which eventually led to a confession. He was charged with murder, kidnapping, and aggravated rape. The pathologist determined that Suzanne Collins died from multiple injuries and had been struck around 100 times. There were bruises and abrasions all over her body. Suzanne had injuries to her skull that could have been caused by the round end of a screwdriver. However, this injury wasn't as Alley had described in his confession, where he said he had stabbed her in the head with the sharp end of the screwdriver. The tree branch that was shoved inside the victim was 31 inches long, and it had been inserted at least 20 inches with enough force to pierce the victim's lung. There was severe internal hemorrhaging. The pathologist believed the victim was still alive during this act. Suzanne did not have any injuries consistent with being struck by a car, which was what Alley said happened. The bruising on her neck was consistent with strangulation. On July 17, 1985, a memorial service was held for Suzanne Collins at the Memphis Naval Air Station. There was a military service, followed by the Marine hymn, and of course taps. On July 18, 1985, Suzanne's funeral was held at the Old Post Chapel in Fort Myer, Virginia. There was not enough room for all the attendees, so some had to listen to the service outside the chapel's doors. Suzanne Collins was buried in grave number 127, section 50, in the Arlington National Cemetery. Sedley Alley's trial began in March 1987, and he entered an insanity plea. He said he was really three people: Sedley, Billy, and Death. Billy was a female, and Death was a menace to society. No one from his family could testify, as they had never met the other personalities. The defense tried to convince the court that one of the other personalities killed the victim. Alley said he could not remember where he was when Suzanne Collins was murdered. Several psychiatrists interviewed him over 30 times and thought he was faking the mental illness because the symptoms only manifested after his arrest. Alley was caught faking the voice of his personality named Death when he talked to his sister over the phone. He told his sister he was going to kill himself by putting a plastic bag over his head and tying it with a sock. Alley's sister notified security, who rushed into his room, only to discover he was not trying to kill himself. Alley complained of hallucinations, tinnitus, depression, paralysis, and headaches. Doctors attributed his symptoms to a long history of drug abuse, and they believed he had been on speed and coke laced with rubbing alcohol when he was being evaluated. Doctors felt confident that he was faking this multiple personality condition. Some of the evidence presented was that paper napkins from an area restaurant called Danvers were found next to Susan at the crime scene and were also found in Alley's car. Type O blood was found on the driver's door of his car. Suzanne Collins was type O, but so was Alley. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Sedley Alley guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, kidnapping, and aggravated rape. The jury found 2 aggravating circumstances: that the murder was especially heinous or cruel, and the murder was committed during the kidnapping and rape. He was sentenced to death and 40 years on each of the other offenses. One of Sedley Alley's many appeals took place in August 1989 and was decided at the state Supreme Court level. The principal argument from the defense was that the court could not establish that Alley was sane. Dr. Wyatt Nichols was a clinical psychologist and examined the defendant on November 7, 1985. He could not provide an opinion since the defendant couldn't recall events on the evening of the murder. The doctor asked his colleagues, who had experience with multiple personality disorder, to interview Sedley Alley. Dr. Willis Marshall and Dr. Alan Battle diagnosed the defendant with multiple personality disorder. Dr. Marshall examined Alley and used sodium amytal along with hypnosis and discovered the alternate personality. One personality was called Power or Death. Another one was named Billy. The doctor argued that if these personalities were in control at the time of the murder, then Sedley couldn't be held responsible for the crime. Under cross-examination, Dr. Marshall did not really have expertise in multiple personalities and had not actually witnessed the alternative personality. Dr. Battle had treated more than a dozen patients with multiple personality disorder. This doctor hypnotized Alley 3 different times and was convinced that the defendant was not faking it. He didn't have an opinion whether the defendant suffered from this condition when he committed the murder. Allie's sister testified she received a call from Sedley, and she heard his voice change when this alternate personality spoke. Dr. Sam Craddock was a clinical psychologist who testified for the prosecution and thought the defendant was exaggerating, as he had no history of this condition prior to the murder. He diagnosed Allie with borderline personality disorder. Dr. Ziller Athar was a forensic psychiatrist in private practice. He stressed that MPD was a rare condition. It usually manifested itself in late adolescence, and 90% of those who had it were female. The doctor had only seen the condition in 3 people during his entire career. The doctor believed that the defendant was a malingerer with borderline personality disorder. All the doctors who testified for the state agreed that Allie's diagnoses were borderline personality disorder, mixed substance abuse, and malingering. Many lay witnesses described Allie's behavior as normal when he was arrested. His behavior became more bizarre right before he met the medical team that evaluated him. Doctors also saw his extensive anger issues. In letters he wrote to his wife, Allie used a lot of inappropriate language. He told her he wanted to urinate on her and rape her. Allie's defense team took issue with the trial judge because he allowed the victim's family to speak about her character and accomplishments. Susan's father, John Collins, was a retired U.S. diplomat, and he worked for 21 years for the U.S. Foreign Service, Department of State. John served in places like Greece, Syria, Sweden, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. In the original trial, he testified he was proud of his kids, as his son was an honors student at the University of Virginia, and Suzanne was hoping to fly planes and wanted to be selected for the fleet in Annapolis, Maryland. Suzanne played sports, took part in church activities, and worked with physically disabled children. In his testimony, John spoke about their last Christmas together as a family and the last phone call he had with his daughter. He also spoke about their decision to have a closed casket funeral because of the brutality of the crime. The defense team objected to this line of questioning, as it was the prosecution's attempt to reinforce that Suzanne got in the wrong car that fatal day, and that her character would have never allowed her to consent to any sexual act with a stranger. The judge allowed a 16 by 20 inch photograph of Susan to remain on display in the courtroom for that first day of testimony. The defense objected to the fact that the trial judge allowed photos of the victim's body from the crime scene to be admitted, especially with her badly beaten face and the tree branch that extended from her vaginal area. The defense argued that the judge allowed the proof of another crime committed by their client. Allie had installed a vacuum pump and gauges at the Admiral's house on the base, close to where Suzanne was jogging. His employer went to the Admiral's house and found that the equipment was missing. The pump was seen in the back of Allie's station wagon on July 11th and was found in his backyard on July 12th. The prosecution made the case that the motive for the kidnapping was Suzanne saw the stolen equipment in Allie's car. There were many other smaller objections by the defense. However, the court decided that his conviction and death penalty sentence would stand, as his appeal was unanimously rejected by all justices. His execution was set for November 13th, 1989, by electrocution. In May 1991, Suzanne's father spoke out against the justice system, as he was upset that the appeal system was keeping his daughter's killer alive. John Collins supported a Bush administration bill that would have blocked the federal courts from reviewing issues raised by prisoners in state courts. The president was trying to push the reform of death row appeals through the system as part of a concession of accepting a 7-day waiting period for handguns. John felt that the judicial system showed more concern for prisoners' rights than victims' rights. Sedley Alley had many appeals, one of which involved the former state Supreme Court Justice, Penny White. She had played a role in having Allie's case sent back to Memphis to be reheard. When Penny was campaigning to be elected to remain on the Tennessee Supreme Court, John and Trudy Collins traveled from North Carolina to Tennessee to take part in an anti-Penny White campaign. The Collins family blamed her for a 4-year delay in Allie's death penalty case. In May 2007, Governor Phil Bredesen reluctantly issued a 15-day reprieve on the day of Allie's execution, so his lawyers could seek a court order for DNA testing. The governor followed the recommendation made by the Board of Probation and Parole, which voted 4-3 in favor of recommending a temporary stay. Allie's lawyers argued 2 different angles. They petitioned the court to test the DNA, and they also made the case that lethal injection was unconstitutional because it caused the inmate to suffer. The governor said, "I believe Mr. Alley to be guilty of this heinous crime. However, I am acutely aware that in capital cases, mistakes cannot be corrected. So out of respect for the board's recommendation, I am reluctantly issuing a reprieve for 15 days. This horrific murder occurred in 1985, and Mr. Alley's conviction has been litigated continuously in the state and federal courts since that time. If Mr. Alley cannot convince the courts to allow such additional testing, or if such additional testing is performed without clearly exonerating Mr. Alley, then the vast weight of the other evidence of his guilt will continue to prevail, and I expect that a new execution date will be scheduled promptly." The prosecutors, of course, asked the judge to dismiss the request to test DNA evidence without having a hearing, because they said it would have no bearing on Allie's conviction. The defense wanted blood, hair, and broken fingernails tested, but the prosecution argued that the evidence was destroyed when a storage freezer at the University of Memphis suffered a malfunction. The testing that had been conducted at the time of the crime determined that the blood and hair found on Allie's car matched the victim. On May 20th, 2006, attorney Barry Scheck from the Innocence Project could not convince the judge that the DNA findings, if the DNA even existed, would change the outcome of Allie's conviction. The prosecution argued that the evidence against Alley was overwhelming, and he had not proclaimed his innocence until recently. At the time of the murder, he confessed and then pleaded insanity. Alley even led the police to the tree where he found the branch that he mutilated Suzanne with. At 9 p.m. on June 27, 2006, the United States Supreme Court rejected an 11th-hour plea from the defense to stop the scheduled execution of Sedley Alley. Shortly after 10 p.m., the governor issued a statement denying clemency, as this case had been so thoroughly litigated in the court system. For his last meal, Alley requested pizza pockets, ice cream, oatmeal cookies with icing, and milk. Allie's son and daughter attended the execution. When asked if he had any last words, Alley turned towards his son and daughter and said, "I love you, April. I love you, David. Be strong and stay together. It's okay." On June 28th, at 2:02 a.m., sodium pentothal was pushed through his veins and served as an anesthetic. Next, pancuronium bromide was administered to stop his breathing. Last, potassium chloride was given to stop Allie's heart. Per protocol, these 3 drugs were given in a less than 3-minute time frame. The prison warden of the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville announced, "This concludes the legal death of Sedley Alley. Time of death, 2:12 a.m. Please exit." Suzanne's parents did not attend the execution, but a statement was read on their behalf. "Rest in peace, Suzanne. The jury sentence has now been carried out. Justice in your name has at last been realized. We will always and forever love you." Normally, this would be where we would conclude the case, but in the aftermath of Sedley Alley's execution, the appeals continued. On May 1, 2019, April Alley petitioned the court in Shelby County for post-conviction DNA testing in her father's case. She also asked Governor Bill Lee to order the DNA testing. Barry Scheck, who was well known for his work on the O.J. Simpson trial, and Vanessa Potkin were both from the Innocence Project and represented April. April Alley released a statement. "I just want the truth. The DNA evidence should have been tested before my father was executed. It's too late for my father, but it's not too late to find the truth. The court or Governor Lee should order DNA testing." Barry Scheck said, "On Mr. Alley's guilt or innocence, this case has all the telltale signs of a wrongful conviction, confession that has been demonstrated to be false by objective forensic evidence, mistaken eyewitness identification, and most disturbing, the refusal to test DNA evidence that could have exonerated Mr. Alley or removed the doubts about his guilt." The Innocence Project team was especially interested in testing the men's red underwear that the police believed the murderer had worn and had been left next to Suzanne's body. Their hope was the testing could lead to another match in the CODIS DNA database, or at a minimum, exclude Sedley Alley as being the perpetrator of the crime. The Innocence Project team felt like much of the evidence against Alley was weak. They received a tip from law enforcement that there was another man named Thomas Bruce who was indicted for sexually assaulting 2 women and murdering a 3rd woman. Bruce attended the same avionics school at the same time as Suzanne Collins. He was arrested in November 2018. The 54-year-old man was a former Missouri pastor. He posed as a customer in a Catholic supply store, pulled a gun, and forced 2 women into sexual acts, and then killed a 3rd woman. Bruce didn't have a prior criminal record, but a 77-year-old woman recognized him from the news and said he forced his way into her home, raped her, and stole her cell phone. This was when law enforcement realized he could be linked to other crimes. Dr. Richard Leo was an expert in false confessions and believed that Alley's confession was probably false, as his statements didn't match the forensics of the crime. Alley said that he hit Suzanne with a car and pressed a screwdriver into her head, but the autopsy results did not support this. The tire tracks at the crime scene did not match his station wagon, and shoe prints did not match his shoes. There was a discrepancy between the time of the confession, which was 2 hours, but only 1 hour was taped. When Alley was pulled over on the night of the crime, the Navy investigator noticed he did not have any visible injuries. The eyewitnesses described the person who abducted Suzanne to be 5'6" to 5'8", short brown hair, dark complexion, and black shorts. Alley was 6'4", medium to long red hair with fair skin, and blue jean shorts. The medical examiner listed Suzanne's time of death to be around 1:30 a.m. Alley had been under surveillance by naval police officers, as this had been the time between his first and second police interviews. Suzanne was dating 2 men who did not know about each other, but they were never looked into. Greg Gonzowski was engaged to Suzanne. He left Memphis 3 weeks prior to her death, as he expected her to join him. Suzanne's other boyfriend was John Borup, who attended the University of Memphis at the time. He met Suzanne at a bar called Flanagan's. Both men thought they were in exclusive relationships with her. Borup was short with dark brown hair. He also drove an Aspen station wagon with Kentucky plates and had dropped her off prior to the murder. This was the first time where there was an attempt to use DNA evidence to exonerate someone who had been executed for their crimes. Ultimately, the Memphis judge ruled the DNA would not be tested, and April Alley would have to let this go. April said, "I'm heartbroken. Frankly, I'm numb." Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit BeyondContemptPodcast.com for the links to the sources and music used in this episode. Research, writing, editing, audio production, and sound design were performed by me, Renee. If you like the show, please leave me a positive review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you so much, everyone.